and North Korea. They have sought to destabilize the free world. They have sought to undermine the United States and our allies. And in doing so, especially with Vladimir Putin and the Iranian-backed Hamas terrorist attacks in Israel, have committed serious war crimes and atrocities that cannot go unpunished. What tools are there at the international level to hold Hamas accountable, to hold Iran accountable, to hold Vladimir Putin and Russia accountable? And what would you like to see done? Mr. Kotler?
Well, you mentioned at this point about an unholy alliance, and there is this metastasizing axis of evil. And I sought to share with you some of the interrelationships here, but international human rights and humanitarian law, both in the cases of Russia's criminal aggression in Ukraine and Hamas's criminal aggression against Israeli civilians. These are the supreme crimes in international human rights and criminal law. And the taking of hostages is a looking glass. And therefore, we need the multilateral coalition to, in fact, implement international human rights and humanitarian law, and to call for the unconditional and immediate release of the hostages at the same time as we seek to secure the release of political prisoners, and to use all the international instruments in that regard. The ICC, which should be used now with regard to Hamas in the same way that it was used with regard to arrest warrants regarding Putin and the like. The independent international tribunal, as I said, because we won't be able to otherwise sanction the crimes of aggression, the leadership crimes. To get the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, who have not been implementing their mandate, and if you speak to the families of the hostages, they'll tell you they've gotten no answers from the ICRC, notwithstanding Hamas's brutal abduction, kidnapping, and forced disappearances of the hostages. So I think what is important here is multilateral coalitions to not only affirm but to implement the foundational norms of international human rights, humanitarian, and criminal law along the initiatives that I mentioned: ICC, International Independent Tribunal, ICJ initiatives, universal jurisdiction approaches, and the like. The whole arsenal of international legal accountability mechanisms.
While I agree with you, part of the challenge here is that the United Nations, for instance, has historically shown a bias against Israel. And just yesterday, the Secretary General said that Hamas's terrorist attack didn't happen in a vacuum, alleging that it is the Israeli people's fault for getting attacked and massacred by the Hamas terrorists. It's disgusting. He should resign in disgrace. You have a situation, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. We have members of Congress who repeat lies that Israel bombed a hospital, repeating it even yesterday, despite all evidence to the contrary. We are dealing with a situation where reality is at odds with the fiction that has been promulgated, the anti-Semitism that has been promulgated by leaders throughout the globe. And so, while I agree with you, these international agencies need to band together with the United States, with our allies, to hold these folks accountable. It's difficult to do that when you have the Secretary General of the United Nations blaming Israel for suffering a terrorist attack and the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust.
Well, Congressman, you've touched on another important point, that we're witnessing not only a resurgent global authoritarianism that I described, but a resurgent and metastasizing global anti-Semitism. The tipping point for which was the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, which turned into a World Conference of Racism and Hate against Israel and the Jewish people. That became the tipping point for the new anti-Semitism. And that new anti-Semitism includes, regrettably, the laundering of anti-Semitism under the very protective cover of the UN, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the very struggle against racism itself. And we have seen manifestations of this not only in the UN, but in our own domestic communities. And so part of our compelling responsibilities here are to combat this resurgent global anti-Semitism. There have been a dramatic rise in hate crimes targeting Jews since Hamas's criminal aggression against it. You would have thought it would have been the other way around. And so we have a moral inversion here. Whereas before Hamas invaded Israel, we had the highest rates of anti-Semitism since audits began 50 years ago. And yet after this invasion, we've had a dramatic increase, not only in anti-Semitic incidences, but anti-Semitic hate crimes targeting Jews. So we have to bear this in mind.
Unfortunately, we've seen this song before, and Israel, as it defends itself, will be under severe international pressure. And again, we have members in Congress demanding ceasefires, but no accountability for the terrorists that beheaded babies, burned babies, murdered Holocaust survivors. They're not worried about the accountability there. It's pathetic. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Mike Lawler, and thank you for referencing the outrageous situation at the United Nations. It's inconceivable. But we now proceed. Hey, we've been joined by Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, and also Congressman Mark Vesey of Texas. So many members of Congress coming indicates how important each of you are as the message gets out of how we need to address political prisoners. And we now proceed to Congresswoman Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, on foreign affairs, you and I speak with one voice.